since I've never seen you all in one place at one time. On behalf of Ellen Toscano, Executive Director of NYU Florence, and the faculty and staff of NYU, I welcome you. This evening, before I begin my introduction, I have been asked to remind you all that if you have cell phones, to please turn them off. This evening, we have the extraordinary opportunity to meet in the Salone dei Cinquecento, the great council hall of the Palazzo Vecchio. There could be no more appropriate setting for Professor Yousefzadeh's talk, which regards events that took place during the period in which Florence became capital of Italy. At that time, the local Florentine administration was temporarily displaced from this town hall, and the Palazzo Vecchio became the seat of the recently established national government. During the 1865 festivity that is at the heart of this talk, over 700 banners were sent from around Italy, one of the most visible signs of the nation's recent unification. To store these banners, a special room was built on the roof of this very palazzo, 2 stories directly over our heads. For this very special privilege, we are grateful to the City of Florence, co-sponsor of this lecture, Cristina Giacchi, the Assessore for Universities, Research and Youth Programs, who had hoped to welcome you personally, is unfortunately home with the flu. We have already been greeted, and he may return to greet you personally, by the President of the City Council, Eugenio Gianni, who we also thank for this opportunity. We are also fortunate this evening to have our lecture co-sponsored not only by the Comune di Firenze, but also by several prestigious local institutions. The Archivio Storico, the historic archive of the city of Florence, where the primary textual sources of Professor Yousefzadeh's research were found, and the Alinari Archive and Museum, where many of the primary visual sources for her work are located. To welcome you on behalf of the Museo Nazionale Alinari della Fotografia is the Director of its Education Department, Gabriella De Polo. Again, our sincere thanks to the Comune. To avoid stealing any more time from this evening's lecture, let me now welcome my friend and colleague, Mahnaz Yousefzadeh, Professor of Humanities in the Global Liberal Studies program at NYU. Dr. Yousefzadeh has recently published an important book, City and Nation in the Italian Unification, the National Festivals of Dante Alighieri, from which her talk this evening is partially derived. Her lecture is entitled Dante's Birthday, Florence and the Aesthetic Education of Italians. Please welcome Professor Yousefzadeh.
For the nice introduction, and it's a particular pleasure and a great honor to be in the Salone del Cinquecento tonight to speak with you. I am grateful to NYU for including me in the impressive program commemorating the 150th anniversary of Italian unity. I would like to begin with the title and illustration for this evening's talk. Is the voice okay? The sound is okay? The title alludes to a seminal essay on the aesthetic education of man by Friedrich Schiller, a poet-philosopher who was celebrated as the national poet of Germany in a series of centenary festivals in 1859. The illustration from the painting behind me, housed in this palazzo on the other side of the courtyard, is of 1865 sexcentenary of another national poet, the Florentine-born Dante Alighieri. I will be speaking about this remarkable episode in the history of Florence and Italian unification to shed light, first of all, on the particular role Florence and the figure of Dante played in the Italian unification, but also to make a few points that have bearings perhaps on our contemporary moment. In May 1865, 50,000 Italians undertook a national pilgrimage to Florence in order to honor the 600th birthday of Dante Alighieri. The first national aggregate of workers, students, academics, artists, professionals, political groups, and ideological factions from the recently united cities. The event was also the most lavish and expensive festival ever hosted by Florence. The participants were not only honoring Dante, but in the poet's name, they were expressing their enthusiasm for the newly united nation state. The sheer number of people within one procession and one piazza, Santa Croce, was repeatedly cited as a testimony to the centenary's true national nature, character. I will give a little historical background to Italian unification, which sets the stage for this event. The Dante Festa took place in the immediate aftermath of unification in 1861 under Victor Emmanuel II, the King of Piedmont. The unification itself was a culmination of a long struggle among various nationalist factions, the Republicans, the pro-papists, and the monarchists. In 1861, Italy was finally united under the rule of Savoy King, with the capital in Turin. Rome was supposed to become the capital, but the Pope remained there, protected by the French troops, and Venice was under the rule of the Austrians. Despite Garibaldi's effort to liberate Rome in 1862, Italy and France reached an agreement in 1864 to establish Florence as the capital city in exchange for the removal of the French troops from Rome. When in 1865 the capital was transferred to Florence, the mood was less than celebratory. The Torinesi were irate to lose the capital. The Florentines themselves were not happy about the arrival of the government. The Democrats thought this was a betrayal of Rome and a sellout to France. And the Pope, who had lost the protection of the French, condemned liberalism, nationalism, and all of modern civilization. In fact, Dante himself appeared upset, as portrayed by this caricature from 1865. Dante and Italy are scolding the Gonfaloniero, mayor of Florence, at Palazzo Vecchio, pointing to Rome on the horizon. A lot has been written about the weakness of Italian identity in these early years. The task of the Italian government after unification was not only to create administrative laws. Those, of course, were debated and passed in 1865. But the challenge was to get the inhabitants of the peninsula to identify with Italy. There were four fundamental interconnected issues that shaped this process. How would the inhabitants of a territory with traditions of strong municipal traditions and identities become Italian without devaluing their local traditions? How are they to modernize without losing vital traditions? What shape to give to their constitution, centralized or federal? And how to energize a civil society that authentically represented the nation. The municipal leaders of Florence enacted a cultural policy which gave a specific syntax to these four tensions. Supportive of the national project, yet protective of the municipal and traditional bases of power, they opted for a strategy of nationalizing local artists and poets. Dante suited this cultural policy exceptionally well. From a Florentine center, and through institutions of civil society, they promoted the myth of Dante as a Florentine son who had fathered Italian unity. While elevating the status of municipality, they created an alternative stage upon which Italians could be patriotic, while at the same time, and this is very important, they could be patriotic while at the same time they could resist Piemontese centralizing policies and hegemony. The resistance to the Piemontese bureaucracy, what many believe was colonizing the peninsula, was central to Florentine cultural policy, or the strategy actually. Florence posited that the long durée of cultural nationalism made a more vital basis for building Italy than the recent territorial nationalism of Piedmont. The latter can be best summarized by the historian Cesare Balbo's provocative declaration. The virile Italian heart would willingly sacrifice Michelangelo, Raphael, and Dante for a warrior who would lead her towards military victory. You can imagine that Florentines might not have wholeheartedly agreed. The fact that they insisted there would be no Italian heart or spirit without Italy's artists and poets, and furthermore, that it was Florence who had given those gifts to Italy. The transfer of capital to Florence made these differences only more acute. The rivalry between the two cities, in fact, was rooted in a mutual sense of cultural superiority. The Piedmontese complained that Florence, as opposed to the modern, spacious, and clean Turan, lacked the stature of a capital. The newspapers insisted that the Florentine streets were nauseating, dirty, and the Florentine traditions such as the Festa San Giovanni were reactionary and backward. When the government functionaries and their families arrived in Florence, they found all things brutto: the climate, the city, the customs, and also the language. But the Florentines did not embrace the idea of their city as the capital either. They were not enthused to serve as a host to the multitude of functionaries moving in. In fact, they referred to the Piedmontese as their new barbarians, who, with their arrival, were about to spoil the perfection, equilibrium, and traditions of Florence. Numerous pamphlets were published that addressed the disturbing issue of I nuovi venuti. Gino Capone, the Tuscan senator, was dramatic. Florence, about to become the capital, is like a young girl who without passion is about to leave her virginal estate. Another Florentine politician observed that the only advantage offered by the thankless task was that it put an end to the Piedmontese hegemony that had always intended to tyrannize Italy under the pretext of unifying it. These sentiments are partly explained by the fact that Piedmont had shown little respect for the inclusion or preservation of other local traditions, while on the other hand, Florence had been involved in a political-cultural project, namely the construction of the myth of Florence as the Athens of the New Italy. The promotion of cultural institutions, restoration and renovation of galleries, museums, libraries, academies, and the flourishing of the Florentine publishing houses formed key components of this project. The question of university reform, for example, is illuminating. Piedmont proposed to streamline the existing university system, which consisted of 19 independent universities, into 4 central ones, effectively abolishing the others. Tuscans resisted not only these structural changes, but the very institutional model, that they preferred the Tuscan educational model, which was more spontaneous, less rigid, less severe, less schematic. This was a fight to maintain the life of Tuscan pedagogical ideals and culture. The same struggle existed as regards to the preservation of artistic and historical artifacts. The 1865 laws sanctioned the expropriation of monasteries for governmental use and the transfer of the artwork into the hands of provincial councils. Thus, the religious orders lost the long-standing custodial role on behalf of the arts. To make matters worse, the Minister of Finance assigned 3 civil and military engineers to organize the logistics of the transfer of the capital. These experts were sent into Florence in order to determine which buildings were the most suitable for the speedy takeover by the national offices. Individual Tuscan senators immediately responded that the governmental occupancy placed precious artwork at a severe risk. As a more concrete response, the Florentine municipality asked the Commissione Conservatrice delle Belle Arti to supervise the Torinese technical experts. The tendencies of the 2 commissions often clashed. The Tuscan commission defended an artistic tradition that, in his view, the technicians were about to vandalize. A May 9, 1865 caricature wonderfully portrays these tensions between the technician and the artist. The caricature depicts the muratore toscano, Giuseppe Bianchi, challenging a horned Falconieri. Falconieri was the Piedmontese engineer in charge of adapting Palazzo Vecchio and this very hall to suit the purposes of the parliament, actually. Giuseppe Bianchi, this is the caption, Giuseppe Bianchi, the Tuscan painter, refuses to allow Falconieri the ox to bring down the ceiling of the Cosimo I. But the aforementioned ox carries on as much vandalism as his followers. Long live the artistic commission. The project for nationalizing and commemorating Dante may be understood in the polarity which distinguished between a national identity drawn from a Florentine artistic heritage and one forged by its antithesis, the Piedmontese bureaucracy. It posited the differences between Florence as the eternal museum and emporio artistico, and Turin as the quintessential modern city, which lacked ancient heroes and monuments of art. The Florentines repeated that unification would be best characterized as the culmination of centuries of cultural and artistic creativity, not the more modern territorial and administrative nationalism of Piedmont. It was in the context of this antithesis, art against bureaucracy, that the Florentine municipality decided to magnificently celebrate the 600th birthday of Dante Alighieri in 1865 as the National Festival of Italy. The Commission's first declaration stated, and this is part of the quotes that are handed out: "Since Dante Alighieri, the greatest poet of the Christian era of modern civilization, was a Florentine, and since the first sign of civilization is to honor the memory of those men who dedicated their geniuses and their lives to bear witness to the truth and serve the country, and since the city of Florence was rich with noble gifts, even when the country was experiencing the worst misfortunes, then honoring its greatest poet is the best way to prove that Florence did not fail to fulfill its task in the Italian family, as well as the best way to show the world that with Dante, the seeds of civilizations were made fertile." Another declaration expressed in a colloquial language for the masses, for the popular classes, addressed why Dante's birthday, rather than adopted Piedmontese Constitution Day, should serve as the day of Italian national festival. Here are two names, Dante and Festa Nazionale, which seem made to be placed side by side and which undoubtedly fit well together. Was he not the first and the greatest of our exiles? Was it not because of Italy's suffering that he left the world before his time and he left to the nation the glorious heritage of the Divine Comedy? Dante and Italy are one and the same. Actually, it would be a good idea if from now on the Festa della Statuto be moved to match the day of Dante's birth, because whether one agrees or not, he was the driving force behind the unification of Italy. There was, of course, irony in this use of Dante to fight Piedmont, since Dante had to be first repatriated in Florence. He needed to be repatriated not only because of his exile from Florence during his lifetime and his death in Ravenna, where his remains were jealously withheld, but also because for most of the 19th century, Dante was by and large studied and performed outside of Florence for reasons of censorship. Other Italian cities, and also nations, had given a home to Dante until Florence was ready to reclaim him. Royal Art Theatre in Turin had been performing Dante plays for 40 years. Plays were staged also in Milan, and it's well known that Dante was a special figure for the Victorians and the Pre-Raphaelites in England. The Dante which was assimilated into Florence cult in the middle of 19th century was a severely political and ethical figure, a poet hero and father of Italian language who had prophesied Italian unity and thus inspired men in their struggle for Italian independence. Secondly, he contained within his persona a series of internal political quarrels because in him many competing political factions found their spokesperson. Finally, Dante was an ethical figure because unification was posed as a redemption of an overdue debt. As an ethical and political figure, Dante was more unifying than as a maker of taste or an aesthetic. Put another way, an aesthetic contradiction lies at the heart of the 1865 Dante celebrations. The architect in charge of the program of the Festa, Giuseppe Poggi, was also responsible for planning the destruction of the medieval section of Florence. In fact, he was planning both simultaneously as part of the same modernizing vision. The designers of the Dante Festa understood that in fashioning the repertoire of a festival, they were deciding the general dispositions, regulations, activities, symbolism, music, decorations, as well as the proper dress, gestures, behaviors, and paraphernalia of the new Italians. This task became the most controversial part of the affair and took over one year with many versions and revisions. From these, a highly controversial 8-day program was ratified and made public, and was then immediately and vehemently attacked, censored, and soon completely suppressed. A new commission was formed to create a second program, headed by Giuseppe Poggi. In suppression of the first program and in the creation of the new one, we see with dramatic clarity the operation of the modernization at work. The first design, put together by Stefano Fioretti, had envisioned a highly popular, organic, and decentralized festa that recalled the life of the times of Dante as much as possible. I will explain it. The program was indeed complicated and unabashedly Florentine. One example of this intricacy is that each day of the 8-day festa was devoted to a specific sector of the society with a corresponding historical float. One to honor Gianni della Bella for the Day of the Artisans, another to Guido Cavalcanti on the Day of the Scientists, another one dedicated to Giotto for the Festa of the Professors of the Fine Arts, and so on. This was a thick pamphlet with many footnotes explaining the history and symbolic significance of each of these events and personalities. A modernist faction in the municipality rejected this program with disdain. They thought it was a farce that went on for far too long. One member, for example, thought that the dances were inappropriate and mere masquerades, and that putting a crown on the head of the poet's colossal statue is ridiculous. The procession of the historical floats and tournaments in various piazzas, all Florentine traditions, were also held to be mere buffoonery. Fatticelli, the great Dante scholar and biographer, found the whole program indecent, lacking decorum, and frivolously diverted the workers away from their work for far too long. Other concerns were exchanged discreetly in private letters, since they were deemed too explosive to be mentioned publicly. We get a glimpse of these from a letter from Enrico Poggi, Giuseppe's brother, to Fatticelli. This is a quote that part of it you all have. What made me most indignant about that program was that series of municipal and republican commemorations and celebrations, almost as though Dante had distinguished himself for his municipal ideas and for his republican spirit, and almost as though this was the opportune moment for celebrating these ideas. Won't people sense the contradiction, or rather the oddity of so many reminiscences that have nothing to do with the present state of Italy? Reminiscences which would merely express the Tuscan vanity. Piedmontese would repeat what they already said at the parliament. We told you so. There are no monarchic tradition in Tuscany. All of their memories are republican and municipal. Let Florence aspire to grander Italian concepts. Let her abandon her provincial memories of independence and of medieval glories. Exile made Dante a citizen of almost all of Italy. I would like Florence to inspire new destinies and to cast aside all remains of a closed-up petty life. Let her open up her thoughts, her memories, her affections, and let her try and embrace all of Italy. Let her no longer speak of her monuments and of her great men, who from now on will be celebrated every day by non-Tuscans as well. A new program was drawn up rather urgently since time was running short. This program was no longer a decentralized festa, and almost all traditional customs were excluded. Here, ceremonial hierarchy reigned, and a special attention was given to the order of appearance of all institutions participating in the procession of representatives. Certain organizations thus gained an unprecedented stature and others lost. The rise of press is remarkable. 100 members of press were for the first time placed at the head of a cortege, followed by other institutions, 31 provincial councils, 543 municipalities, 15 national guards, 208 mutual aid societies, 113 academies, 159 schools and universities, 44 professional committees. I would like to bring attention to a series of suppressions that were pivotal in making the order in the second program, which are also the kind of exclusions that make the liberal order possible. By censoring Florentine popular traditions, the second program nearly cut out, in fact, the popular element and the spirit altogether. Notably, in the first program, mutual aid or worker societies had been allocated a central position. Now they would appear as a single body, now they would appear not as a single body, but divided vis-a-vis their respective provinces alongside other institutions, such as academies and schools. Effectively, this form of representation reinforced the new order. Yet, remarkably, even if there was greater control of the festa, rather than popular festivity in the final program, the organizers managed to execute a design that was perceived as exceptionally moving, popular, spirited, and truly national. They managed this through organization of a space, of bodies in a space, and a plethora of speeches and plaques and slogans that were rendered unforgettable by their frequent citations in the press. Piazza Santa Croce was lavishly decorated, so was the city, and especially the streets from Piazza Santo Spirito to Piazza Santa Croce, where the procession would traverse. The procession, upon entering Piazza Santa Croce, was welcomed with a banner declaring, "Italians, honor the great poet. The homage that you render to him vindicates the debt of 6 centuries and attests to the world the fact that you are a nation." An English delegate reported that Piazza Santa Croce had become the nucleus of a great nation. For the first time in history, the Italian nation came together as one man. At the piazza, the symbolic unity of Italians through Dante was performed through various ceremonies. After a grand symphony, the gonfaloniere, wearing a dramatic yellow robe, uttered what was reported to be a highly performative speech, which is partly reproduced in your handout. I will just read a few sentences because it's long. "Gentlemen, from Alighieri, Italy had her language, the first element of unity. From him, she also had the idea of nationality, which for 5 centuries has been working within her. All of us here assembled and come together from the most distant parts of Italy, come to affirm again in the face of the whole world the glorious resurrection of the Italian nation and our indissoluble unity, our independence." This and other speeches certainly helped to give a sense of unity and order to the thousands of discrete organizations that have traveled the long road and gathered in Florence, from Sicily, from Campania, from Puglia in the south, and the small towns in the mountainous north. Organizations such as Masonic lodges, which rarely came out in public ceremonies, and workers' fraternities who had come out to insist on the representation despite the fact that their hero, Garibaldi, was not present and was excluded. But how did organizers manage to create the spirit of the nation, the whole at the festa? The year-long cultural and nationwide outreach, such as Dante lotteries, publications of popular editions of the Divine Comedy, school competitions, and other initiatives certainly help promote the idea of Dante in Italian unity. At the festa itself, colorful decorations, banners, speeches, as well as poetry recitations, and the musical performances compensated for the spirit and the Dionysian enthusiasm which was excluded as part of the censure of the first program. Yet there is more. The way Florence organized this festa bears witness to the process through which they constituted the body of Italian nation and imbued it with a national spirit. We get a glimpse of this process from the way the Commission issued invitations to and ordered participation in the festa, in the event. After they issued an announcement in the newspapers that all Italian cities and corporations who represent the nation should also be represented in the festa, a massive torrent of letters arrived from across Italy and abroad. The sheer mass of this material itself produces a compelling image. At a moment when the Italian territory as a whole remained largely unknown to its elite unifiers, and when conversely the political center was foreign to the cities, the secretary of the festa received a deluge of letters. These include 1,300 letters from the institution of civil society and municipalities, as well as thousands of random contributions, suggestions, and proposals from individuals. An image of Florence, not only as a cultural center, but as a logistical hub, emerges. The Commission treated the flood of letters in two different ways. The 1,300 letters were numbered, arranged and rearranged into categories of representatives at the festa and of the nation, those who would participate in the orderly procession and the ceremony. The remainder, stored randomly and never publicized, remained almost in the original state, in no order at all, dusty and untouched. These two ways of archiving the material bear witness to two components of nation formation. The numbered documents serve as tools in the construction of the nation as a structured society or liberal order. Conversely, the thousands of letters, poems, and curiosities that were never counted, were most likely never read, and certainly didn't enjoy no display at the festa. These incarnated the nation as a spirit, the national soul that cannot be counted as one of the sectors which make up the actual nation. These abject missives that were not counted from individuals who did not count are mixed in with unidentifiable tokens, paper scraps, medallions, memos, partial lists, business cards, hand-decorated pamphlets held together with colored ribbons, and of course the copious poems, many singing to the nation. These function as silent witness to the sheer presence of the nation. Silent because, for the historians, as for the festa organizers, most important is not what these documents say, but only that they are there, that the nation exists. The numbered documents, the counted representatives, formed part of a new, tangible Italy in the middle of the 19th century. The uncategorized documents represent the nation as undivided whole. The Dante Festa was an Italian festa because it constructed these two elements of the nation. I have spoken thus far about the way Dante and Florentine culture created an alternative platform for Italians to express their patriotism and resist Piedmont's bureaucracy at the same time. Many Italians felt this patriotic model to be liberating for that reason, and this is why so many, including those who were ideological foes of the elite organizers, such as the Garibaldini, participated in the Dante Festa enthusiastically. It is remarkable to find that more than twice as many worker societies participated in the Dante Festa than in their own national congress the year before. and that more people came from the south than the north. Even women, who were typically excluded from national festivals, created their own private Dante parties and thus participated in the event. So, the event is a testimony of the fact that the arts and culture mobilize and can revitalize communities. But I've also talked about the problems inherent in the issues of the arts as a basis of collective identity. We saw that aesthetic choices were not politically neutral in the revising the program of the centenary. They served to replace the traditional mode of association and subjects and a folk culture with a new order and a modern proto-mass culture. I want to conclude by probing into the ways these questions are relevant to the contemporary debates over citizenship in Florence, in Italy, but also globally. Artistic and cultural heritage as a basis for collective identity is controversial. Now, as we have seen, it was during the Dante Festa. I will illustrate this point with a discussion of a recent statement on the 50th anniversary of the death of Ottone Rosai, a lesser-known Florentine artist. It was issued by the Office of the Florentine Province in Palazzo Medici Riccardi in the San Lorenzo district, a neighborhood which has recently undergone a dramatic transformation with the arrival of immigrants. Rosai is a painter of Fiorentinita. In his paintings, we often recognize the streets, the houses, the expanses of landscapes, which are so familiar and precious. He is the painter of every day. His paintings conform to beauty and the power of normality. Rosai is profoundly Tuscan also in technique. In his images of common people, we find the sacredness of being, as if his singers, players, peasants, gendarmes are confronting the universe. His paintings, in short, are a synthesis of the fundamentals of our community, of deep, profound, cultural roots in the most total sense of the word. It is for all these reasons that the staging of this exhibition makes us proud of being Florentine. This statement has the virtue of being explicit about the political implications of aesthetic evocations, while underlining the importance of creativity and the arts. They mobilize through precise strategies that can offer a voice to sentiments directed at the shifting social and ethnic configuration of Florence. This strategy is repeated during the contemporary events that promote artistic heritage. For example, during the 25th anniversary of the Declaration of Historical Center of Florence as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the director reminded citizens, visitors, and also tourists that Florence entered the list of UNESCO by right because it represents a testimony of art and culture recognized all over the world. The list of those who are reminded of the uniqueness of Florence is telling. Citizens, visitors, and tourists. These three groups represent people that since the 19th century and up until 15 or 20 years ago were the predominant inhabitants of the city. Florentines, expatriates, cultural tourists, and students. The latest arrivals, the immigrants, are conversely not important. It's not an oversight or tangential. They cannot be reminded of the artistic and cultural value of Florence because, as it is implicit in the statement above, they are assumed not to have known this heritage. They represent the first group since the 19th century that visiting or living in Florence do not pretend to participate in the maintenance of the image of a Florence, an image that was rendered mythical in the 19th century. The myth was reinforced through active participation of many foreigners, visitors, Dante scholars, writers, poets, expatriates, all of whom walked, watched, appraised, appreciated, and beheld the art and the landscape and shared in the artistic and heritage and cultural rights of this city. It would in fact be impossible to Florence without taking into account the contribution of outsiders. As a curator of the 1865 Dante exposition, one of the first national exhibitions of United Italy, observed, "There is nothing vainer than a public exhibition. The importance lies in those who see, or rather in those who look." I would suggest that in this operation, that of looking, is above all others, the one that the contemporary newcomers in Florence failed to execute. They therefore do not fit within either of one of the long-established and legitimated Florentine categories, resident or visitor. They fail to take their place as visitors since they do not serve as spectators. On the contrary, they themselves turn into that spectacle, one deemed not as picturesque as the native Florentines of Ottone Rosai, nor as sublime as the statue of Dante. They do not contribute to the sustenance of the myth of Florence, so passionately constructed, negotiated, promoted nationally in 1865 centenary. So I will end here by asking a question that I posed in the beginning, or I meant to pose. Given the importance of arts and culture in building and revitalizing communities, how do we do this in a globalizing world without either losing our cultural genes or giving voice to conservative sentiments? Everyone is asking the same question, yet the response might prove different depending on your particular locality. I will take my lead from Foucault and thus situate myself. Under the apotheosis of Cosimo I, in Palazzo Vecchio, here in Florence, I, an American historian, have spoken to you about Dante Alighieri and his centenary with my very Iranian accent. The event itself leaves me with, and may point to, a positive image of possibilities for cultural encounters and perhaps even of exile.
Our thanks to our speaker for this evening. I have decided, in the interests of time and your attention, to ask only one question of our speaker, just to give her an opportunity to respond informally to something that was suggested by her talk. I found particularly provocative the connections you made between the cultural program of the 1860s and the current social climate in Italy. Just this past week, the President of Italy met with second and third generation immigrants and urged the Italian government to respond to their urgent need to be regularized as citizens of this country. During the confidence vote that confirmed the newly instated technical government headed by Mario Monti, the head of the Democratic Party, Pierluigi Bersani, then made the question of citizenship for children of regular immigrants a priority issue for the new government. 150 years after unification, do you think that new Italians can be, I've lost you, there you are, can be made, or that integration remains an impossibility in Italy?
First of all, thank you all for staying. I know you all have midterms, it's midterm time, thank you. I'm giving those online to my students in New York. Well, this is a big question, the question of the second or third generation immigrants in Italy, whether it's possible, how is it possible to become Italian, and how does it to become a citizen. I have tried to say that the question of citizenship, which usually is discussed around the question of right and law, and the principles of right and law, doesn't really exhaust this matter at all. That I've tried to bring attention to these other aesthetic, the language is just as important now it was there. So thank you very much.